Welcome to the Tales of a Gearhead podcast. I'm your host, Stacey David. This podcast is brought to you by LMC Truck. Keep them on the road is their slogan, and they supply the parts to help you do that. Also, Cornwell Tools, the choice of professionals and hot rods and enthusiasts alike. If you want quality tools, Cornwell's the place to go. Let's get to it. You know, I was hanging out with my buddies the other day at this car cruise-in, and we're just talking cars, and I'm listening to people talk with cars. One thing really struck me, that people really don't understand what's involved in dropping in a crate engine. Because guys were like, yeah, man, I'll just get a crate engine, I'll just drop it in there, and it's gonna be like, you know, $2,000 and I'll be back on the road. All they're doing is looking at the cost of the crate engine. So as we discussed it, you know, and I started talking with these guys about what's all involved about doing this kind of thing, their eyes got bigger and bigger and bigger. And I realized that this industry is really not doing anybody any justice by not telling people all of the hidden costs that go into dropping in a new engine. And these costs are really variable, so it's hard to have an exact amount. That's one of the reasons, you know, that I wrote the project planning book. So you can sit down with your planning book and go through the list that I'm about to go through, so you can really get an idea what this thing's going to cost you. Now, for those of you out there that don't know what a crate engine is, let me just kind of give you a little history. You know, back in the day when we all started building cars and trucks and hot rods and stuff, you basically would build your own engine or go to an engine builder, and that would be your hot rod engine. Then you would drop it in your vehicle. So, and it was generally a version of the engine that the vehicle came with. If your vehicle came with a Chevy engine, small block Chevy, you built a hot small block Chevy, usually using the engine that came in the car. That's how it was done for decades. And then all of a sudden the crate engine thing hit in the late 90s, early 2000s, to where you could go down to General Motors or Ford or various engine builders and just buy a brand new crate engine. Now the crate engine comes basically in two configurations. One is the short block, which is just basically an assembled block. So it has crank rods and pistons in it, and then you do everything else, you know, heads on up. And then you get the long block, which has the heads on it and sometimes an intake, sometimes even a carburetor. And obviously that's more expensive. But then everything else is on you. And what a lot of people tend to overlook is generally when you're putting a new engine in, you don't want to use a bunch of old pieces. So what you do is you buy a crate engine, then you buy all this new stuff, and all of a sudden what you thought was $3,000 has become really expensive. For those of you that are thinking about dropping a crate engine into your vehicle, these are just things to think about. And if you don't have a project planning book, you need to get one so you can go through this stuff and add it up, so you don't end up, you know, at the end of the project going, I don't have any money left and my truck is years from being done. So here we go. Okay, first of all, you got your crate engine. And you're going to drop, let's say it's a small block Chevy and it's a 383 stroker, you want 450 horse, you know, so the engine's $3,500, $4,000 just for the long block. Okay, now to go down on top of it, you need the carburetor or a fuel injection unit, depending on what you're going to use. Now, if you're going to do a carburetor and you need an intake, you know, that's a certain price. Let's say, you know, a new Holley carburetor with a YN intake, you know, you're probably $700. Or you could put on one of the Sniper fuel injections for just a tick under $1,000. You know, so let's just say roughly $1,000. Okay, now you need your throttle brackets and your springs. You know, those little springs and those little brackets, you know, most of the ones on the regular engine are all rusty and nasty. You don't want to use those. Low Car's got some really nice ones out there. Let's just say $20 for those. Now your throttle cable. You know, most of the time your throttle cable is nasty and you really don't want to reuse it. And for the longest time you didn't have an option. But now, like I said, Low Car's got all kinds of throttle cables. They got them in stainless, they got them in black, and they have different ends on them, so you can really fit them to that new carburetor that you're putting on or that new fuel injection. So let's just say, you know, $70 for a throttle cable. Okay, now you need your heater hoses and your fittings for your intake, because that new intake does not come with the heater hose fittings. So let's just say $20 for those. Now you need your fuel pump and the rod, because if you use a mechanical fuel pump, the little rod that goes up and actuates the fuel pump doesn't come, you know, and you don't have the fuel pump either. So let's just say, you know, that's anywhere from 30 bucks to 150 if you're going to go to a electric fuel pump. Let's just say 60 bucks. Now we have a fuel pressure regulator. If you're running fuel injection, you need that. If you're running carburetor, you may not need it, but let's just say 50 bucks on that. Then you got to have some sort of a fuel filter. Let's just pick a nice round number there. That's $50. Then you need various fuel fittings to make all this stuff work. That's another 40 bucks there. I'm keeping a total here, so you guys don't have to. Then obviously you need some fuel line, and you need something that is compatible with the new ethanol fuels. So let's just say 40 bucks there. Earl's has some great stuff, fittings and line. It can climb pretty quick, but let's just keep it down. You really don't want to use your old fuel lines. Then of course you got to have an air filter of some sort. And if you're putting in a cool engine, you know, you may spend 100 bucks on that. Now keep in mind, everything I'm naming here, you may not have to do, but it's going to be tempting to go ahead and replace them. That's why I'm just kind of throwing them in here. All right, then you need a PCV valve. It's, you know, 20 bucks there. You probably want to use a different dipstick. A lot of crate engines do not come with a dipstick, and you probably don't want to use the original, so you're back to low car, you know, for, you know, 50 bucks on that. You know, one for the transmission, you know, another, let's just round it up at 50. How about a distributor? Okay, you can reuse your original distributor, but you may not want to. If you're adding a crate engine with more power, well, a distributor is one area where you're really going to be able to see a difference. So let's just say we step up $300 on a, you know, a nice pro billet distributor from like MSD or whatever. All right, and you might as well stick some new plugs and wires in there. Let's just say 50 bucks on those, which that's probably light, but let's just say that. And then we need a coil of some sort. That can run anywhere from 20 to 120. Well, let's just say, you know, let's just say 20 bucks on that. An ignition box. You're doing any kind of performance stuff, you probably want an MSD ignition box or something comparable. It's a couple $100, 250 bucks, something like that. Then you get to your accessories. Now, if you just keep everything stock like we just did on this Jeep engine, you know, you put on a new water pump, that's about 30 bucks. A starter's about 60, an alternator's about 100. You know, you got your brackets and your pulleys. You can come in fairly cheap on this if you want to keep your stock accessories until you start getting into like a air conditioning compressor. However, since most people are putting a crate engine into a custom deal, well, they want some nice accessories. You want the polished alternators. You want the nice small air conditioning compressors, you know, from Vintage Air or somebody like that. Man, you can drop anywhere from $500 to $2,500 for a nice accessory package. So let's just say $1,000 on that, because you can drop that pretty easy. Now we have power steering hoses and fittings. Obviously, if you don't have power steering, this is not a problem, but most people do. So let's say $100 to replace the hoses, get all the proper hoses in there. And then you also need your air conditioning hoses and fittings. And so, you know, a hose kit from Vintage Air or somebody like that, let's just say $100 to get the fittings and the hoses. Now we're to the exhaust system. How about your headers and your gaskets and your header bolts? Well, you probably don't want to use the old original manifolds, so you stick headers on. Let's just say $400. You can spend a whole lot more for stainless ones, but let's say 400 bucks. And now your motor mounts. We're assuming that you're just replacing the motor mounts. Let's say 50 bucks on those. Valve covers, you might want something slick, something polished aluminum, something that might, you know, add some dress to the engine, because valve covers and the air cleaner are kind of the two sweet spots still. So let's throw $100 on that. You'll need a thermostat. You'll need that upper thermostat neck. That does not come. That's one of those little trinkets that you are always like, whoa, I didn't realize I needed this. A lot of times the original ones are rusty. You don't want to mess with those. So let's say 50 bucks. And then you'll need new sending units, you know, possibly for your gauges. Let's just say $50 on that, just for this miscellaneous hookups and that kind of thing. Now, the grand total of everything here, you guys go ahead and think, what do you think it is? Well, in case you're wondering, we're just a tick under $4,000 for all of this stuff. That does not include the crate engine. So we were saying that the crate engine is roughly $4,000. You just jumped up to 8,000 bucks. That's just putting a crate engine in with new hardware and new things to make it look good. That doesn't include stainless hardware. That doesn't include all those other things. That number is shocking, That is not a number that people talk about, and I think that's something that people really need to see. So now when you look at that, you're like, whoa, okay, now that I know this, what can I back off on my project that I don't have to do all this, where I can keep this within my budget? And I'm talking a stock apple-to-apple swap, like a small block Chevy and putting in a new crate engine small block Chevy. I'm not talking about putting a diesel in or taking out an old 360, putting in a modern Hemi. That gets all into a whole nother world. This is just doing a crate motor swap. So hopefully that gives you an idea kind of what's involved in this, so you don't get surprised in the middle of it. Because what happens, and listen, this happens to everybody, is that you can get in the middle of a project and you start not adding this up until you start looking at your receipts. Your wife or your girlfriend or you will sit there and go, gosh, why is my bill so high? Why is my credit card maxed out? And then you're like, oh, $100 here, 300 there. You know, as they say, time to pay the fiddler. Be careful what you do. Keep on your budget, keep track of what you're spending, and you will have a great time with your project. You know, people ask me all the time, what kind of opportunities are there in the automotive industry? One, if you want to be your own boss, you might want to consider being a Cornwell tool dealer. I mean, they're always looking for people. They have routes everywhere. They're America's oldest tool company. They make the best tools in the industry, and they're a great company to work for. If you're looking to be your own boss, start your own business, and tired of cranking on wrenches, you may want to be a tool dealer. Just to give you an example of this is something that happened to me years ago when I was first starting out building cars. I had my hot rod, you know, and it had just a stock engine out of a junkyard in it. It had a 351 Windsor in it. And this was the 30 Model A with an exposed engine. It kind of looked like the American Graffiti car. So obviously I had to have a cool looking engine. And the first accessory that I ever bought was a set of Edelbrock valve covers. The finned aluminum valve covers had the name in there. Man, I saved up my money. I think they were $150. Man, I went down there. It was every dime that I had. And I was so excited about these valve covers. I'm like, this will change everything. No longer will my engine look like crap. These valve covers are going to change everything. So I get back to the house and I pull off the old valve covers and I open up those new valve covers, and I have valve covers and gaskets. I don't have any of that really cool chrome hardware that everybody wanted to use at the time, the little bullet looking things. Didn't have those, didn't have the T-handle deals. It didn't have a breather with it. And a breather's like $50 more. And those bolts, you know, are another $50. It didn't have a PCV, it didn't have any of the stuff that went with it. It was just the valve covers. And so I'm looking at it, it's like, I thought this would solve all my problems. It's like, no, you're still a dork. You still need some chrome. You still need some parts. So I had to save some more money. And in the meantime, I had to use my original breathers, those old blue ones, in those beautiful polished aluminum valve covers. I'm like, this looks so stupid. And at that time, you know, even back then, companies like Edelbrock and Holley and those guys, they didn't really tell you the other stuff that you needed. They actually just assumed that you knew that. Now, you know, when you go to order something, especially online, you can go in and at the bottom of the page, obviously it'll come up, it's like, you may also want, and you want to pay attention to that, because that's telling you, hey, these are the parts that you're also going to need that are not included in this. Yeah, that was a big eye-opener for me. Started realizing that, boy, you really have to do some research or you end up with the dorky valve covers. You know, back when I was first getting into working on cars, when you needed parts, you went to the salvage yard, or the junkyard as we always called it. Well, those days are kind of gone. So the question is, where do you find good replacement parts? Well, you've heard me talk about LMC Truck all the time, and that's one of the main reasons. Flip open one of their catalogs or go online and look at it. It's almost like an owner's manual. There's an exploded diagram of the vehicle. You can see where the parts go. Man, it's such a great way to help you with a project, especially if you're not familiar with it, and it's also a great source of getting the parts you need. Okay, this question comes from Stacey Wayne Scott. Okay, first of all, you get the award, Stacey, for having the coolest name, because you know, people say, you know, I have 2 first names. You have 3 of them. Stacey Wayne Scott. Man, that's like awesome. But anyway, Stacey Wayne Scott says, I am building a 75 Chevy Laguna. Okay, first of all, hats off for doing a cool car, man. You just don't see many of those, especially that era. And he says, I know it will never drive and handle like a brand new car, but is there any tricks or other suspension parts that will interchange and work? If you could give me some ideas, that would be great. Well, you don't say what your budget is. I assume that you're on a tight budget or you don't want to spend any more than you have to. But actually, there are a lot out there for those 70s and 80s Chevys, GM vehicles. Now, you don't really say how you want it to handle, you just say you want it to handle better. Let's go away from the junkyard stuff because you don't need to do that anymore. And there's such a great aftermarket out there. So the first thing I would do is I would tell you to go to John Hotchkiss at Hotchkiss Suspension. John's been doing great stuff. He has all kinds of things for these vehicles. Springs, sway bars, spindles, that kind of thing. We're not talking a lot of money, and believe me, he will get that car handling well. It'll handle better than you ever thought it would. Now, if you want to go deeper than that, there's companies out there like Ride Tech or Schwartz Performance. These guys are all friends of mine. They all make great products, but they start to get into complete suspension swaps, upper and lower control arms, coilover shocks, sway bars. Schwartz Performance specializes in complete replacement chassis. There's Art Morrison that's got that kind of stuff. There's Chris Olson's Chassis Works. They have great things like that. There's a lot of guys that are doing these bigger muscle cars. But as I've said, these budgets start to go up, and it doesn't sound like you're looking to do something that big right now. So I would just start by calling somebody like Hotchkiss and just saying, listen, I want the car to handle a little better. Tell them what you want and see what they can do for you. And then you can just go from there. All right, we got a classic muscle car question here from Dion. He says, I got a 70 Chevelle. It's got a 396, 4-speed. He said it needs a complete wiring kit, bumper to bumper. What is the best, easiest to install, and least expensive basic wiring kit to buy? Now listen, you can't have all three of those. You can't have the best, the easiest to install, and the least expensive, because you do get what you pay for. Now, I know what you're asking for. Listen, man, obviously I've used Painless for years. I'm really familiar with their systems. They make a great system. There's other ones out there. Ron Francis makes a good product, so does American Auto Wire. It really comes down, one of the reasons that I like Painless is that they offer both original style wiring harnesses, and then they offer the Resto Mod, upgradable harnesses. And they just do a really good job with this. For example, you'll need to make sure you order the right kit. Now that's the key here. If you go to Painless and say, listen, I've got a 70 Chevelle, the first thing they're gonna say is it all original, or are you Resto Modding it? In other words, are you putting modern air conditioning, a tilt column, that kind of thing, because that is a different wiring harness. They have to give you a harness that is compatible with some of that newer stuff. So it's important that you make sure you order the right part. Once you do that, putting these things in is not hard. And man, it's so much better than how it was when I first started. My first vehicle, that was any account, 1930 Model A Coupe. And when I crawled up underneath it to do some wiring on it, all the wiring was red. In other words, somebody had a ball of red wiring and they just wired under the dash with red wiring. So everything was red, all the grounds were red, and there was one fuse in a car. You remember they had those old headlight switches that just had one fuse, big old honking fuse, about 30 amps, and it ran all the lights and everything in the vehicle. And the reason I know that is because one night I was driving the car out with my friends and all the lights went out. Hello. And a wild fury ensued, and I crawled under the dash and I found the blown fuse. So here we are, we're out tooling around late at night. Everybody's got their cars, people trying to show off for the girls and everything. And I have a car and no fuse and no lights. So what do? Well, we did the old Wrigley Spearmint gum fix, where you take the aluminum wrapping off of a piece of gum and create your own fuse. Yeah, not the safest thing. Believe me, you can burn the car to the ground. We did not burn the car to the ground, but you can. But anyway, that's how we got it back home. And that's when I started digging into wiring and realizing that if I was going to do this, if I was going to have my own cars, I wasn't even thinking about building cars for a living or anything like that. I just wanted cars that I thought was cool that I could drive. And I realized that if I was going to have those kind of cars, then I had to be able to work on them, because you couldn't just take them anywhere and have somebody work on them. So that's when I started learning about wiring. Boy, it sure is easier now with the stuff that Painless has. So that's my suggestion. I would go to Painless, tell them what you got, and they'll set you up with a kit that'll drop in there, man. You will love it. Keep in mind, this podcast is made possible by our friends at LMC Truck and our friends at Cornwell Tools. All right, that wraps it up for us today. It is time for you to get out there, start working on something, build something with your own two hands, send in your questions, send in your pictures, let us know what you're working on. All right, we'll see you later.